2024 is over and the new car sales figures are out here in the UK. Now is a great time to investigate the trends in battery electric vehicle sales. Has the growth in EV sales stalled, as some outlets have been reporting during the year? Or might the headlines be misleading? Opinion is sometimes useful, but colouring a story to meet a particular narrative is a bit dishonest. Let's have a look at the underlying data to get a better understanding of what's happening in the market. You may have seen headlines in the last day or two suggesting the ZEV mandate targets were missed. However, a single figure can't actually represent this mandate. There is some devil in the detail we need to tease out. We'll come back to that later, but first let's look at the facts and figures. I'm specifically going to focus on BEV sales today, as that's the only viable option for achieving the ZEV mandate targets at the moment. There are a couple of manufacturers attempting to sell hydrogen fuel cell electric cars in the UK, but the numbers being sold are so small as to be pretty much irrelevant. That's partially because there are only 6 sites in the UK where the public can refuel them, a number that continues to decline. Okay, so let's consider the sales figures. In 2024, just under 382,000 BEVs were sold, in comparison to 315,000 in 2023 and 267,000 in 2022. So the growth in the number of cars sold continues, up 21% from 2023, which itself was up nearly 18% from 2022. Numbers are still increasing. The market as a whole was up 2.6% on 2023, so the increase in BEV sales is significantly higher than the increase in total sales, showing that the transition is still happening. These numbers are a bit dry though. Were all of those sales in a single month? Let's have a look at graphs of sales by month. The one thing we need to be mindful of is that the total number of car sales varies dramatically by month. We can't easily just plot the number of sales on a graph and get any sense out of it, as they bounce around wildly, as we can see here in this graph of total new car sales by month. We have huge peaks in March and September when the new registration plates come out. People still like their neighbours to see that they have the latest and greatest. Therefore, I find it helpful to visualise the sales in a way that removes that variability, and therefore all of my graphs will show the percentage of sales for a particular fuel type in any month, which makes the information a bit more accessible. Note too that I'm allowing the axes to auto-range here, so not every graph will necessarily be drawn to exactly the same scale. Don't try to compare between different graphs. Instead, the points being made should all be visible on a single graph in each case. For initial context, I want to show some historical trends. Here is a graph of the percentage of new car sales that were BEVs between June 2020 and December 2023. It's worth me mentioning why I've chosen June 2020 as the start point, and that it's because of the lockdowns we had here in the UK in the second quarter of 2020. Coronavirus was a big shock for the UK car market. I specifically wanted to exclude April 2020, as almost no cars were sold at all that month, leading to a large and untrustworthy peak in the graphs of the EV sales. It's not real, and it's very distracting, as it can change the scale of some of the graphs. You'll notice that this graph has some big peaks on it. I'm going to come back to those later. Instead, what I'm looking for at the moment is the overall long-term trend, largely ignoring those end-of-year peaks. What I see from this is that BEV sales had slowed a bit. We can see quite good growth in 2021, the first 40% of the graph or so, but both 2022 and 2023 show less rapid change. If we look at 2022, we can see that the data is quite noisy. The line is jumping above and below the 15% trend line, whereas in 2023 it's above the 15% line for everything except January. So I don't know about you, but I see somewhat stalled growth in this graph. It had undoubtedly slowed down. Sales had probably stopped growing, although that's not the same thing as declining, of course. Before we move on, let's just take note of those end-of-year peaks again. We can see that sales go up in November, and then up by even more in December. This happened in 2020, 2021 and 22, but not so much in 2023. There is more to talk about on those peaks. I think they're of interest in the story, but not quite yet. Instead, let's add 2024 to the graph and see how that looks. So that's interesting. The first couple of months of 2024 look a lot like 2023, but from May there's a bit more of an uptick. What's more, that end-of-year peak is back again. That had gone away in 2023, but it's back with us at the very right-hand side of the graph. Not quite to the same level as 2022, but almost. Let's change the visualization a bit. In this graph, I've dropped the incomplete 2020 data, and I've overlaid the years as different series. This shows January on the left and December on the right, and each line represents a different year. Now we can see that in the middle of the year, the height above the axis fits with the overall trend that we thought we'd seen. Between April and October, 2022 is at the bottom, 23 is in the middle, and 2024 is at the top. And if we zoom out, we can see that trend at the granularity of a year. This one goes all the way back to 2019, and again is showing percentage of the new car sales market that was BEVs. Sure enough, while we have full years of data for every year, this is perhaps the clearest of the visualizations, although it is only helpful once a year, remember. In this view, we can clearly see that there was no growth in the BEV market share in 2023. Indeed, there was a tiny decline of 0.1%, and that the continued sales growth we saw, the numbers going up, was because of growth in the total market. But the growth in market share is back again in 2024. Growth is not as fast as before. It would have been lovely to have seen the penetration figure a bit higher still, but it's growth, and it is indeed back. So that's the sales data, all sliced and diced to gain better understanding. But the question was, is the ZEV mandate target being achieved? The headline figure of BEV market penetration was 19.6%, and the target for the year was 22%. So in theory, the answer is no, it wasn't achieved. But this is where we find it gets complex. You see, the 22% figure is really a baseline. It's what manufacturers would need to do if they did nothing else. But there are other things they can do. These are the flexibilities built into the regulation. I'm going to do a brief overview of the flexibilities here, but if you want a slightly more in-depth review of them, I covered that in a previous video. I'll link to that from the end screen and the description. Okay, let's start with an example of the baseline to help with the discussion. If a manufacturer sells 100,000 cars in 2024, then the baseline is that they would need to sell 22,000 zero-emission vehicles. That's our 22%. In fact, they would be considered to have 22,000 ZEV credits to spend, and all of them would be used. However, the first set of flexibilities is that some ZEV sales count as more than one. For example, car sharing through car clubs is considered to be a societal benefit, so the sale of a ZEV to a car club would earn 1.5 ZEV credits. Car clubs such as Zipcar or Co-Wheels are not massive in the UK at the moment. This is a concept that has seen larger rollout in parts of mainland Europe. However, there are some car clubs, and so some manufacturers will benefit from selling to them. The next example is special purpose vehicles, hereafter known as SPVs. These are generally modified vehicles, things like hearses, ambulances and motor caravans. SPVs are actually exempted from the mandate, so the sale of an ICE vehicle in this category doesn't count towards the non-ZEV element of the regulation. However, a zero-emission SPV gains 2 credits on the scheme to encourage their uptake where possible. And one type of zero-emission SPV, A wheelchair accessible vehicle, known as a WAV, gains 2.5 credits, so that people needing them do not find themselves excluded from the transition unnecessarily. The numbers of sales in these categories are probably not huge, but they are non-zero, and hopefully they start to explain how the baseline figure is very slightly misleading. It's possible that our mythical example manufacturer could reduce their sales requirement using these flexibilities, perhaps to 21,000. The next range of flexibilities are to do with trading of credits. They can borrow credits from their own allocations from future years, although there is a form of interest accrued from that, currently 3.5%. They can buy credits from other manufacturers. That's not a zero-cost option, and you'd imagine there might not be quite enough to go around, as the market was beneath the 22% baseline, until we start to consider the other type of trading. You see, there isn't quite one set of requirements in the mandate, but two, because there are also requirements placed upon the non-ZEV portion of their sales, the ICE cars. In order to avoid manufacturers losing focus and allowing the CO2 emissions from the non-ZEV portion of the fleet going up again, they are required to achieve a CO2 fleet emissions target for those cars. That target is that their average emissions must not exceed those they achieved in 2021. That's a cap that cannot be exceeded without some cost, the same cost that would have applied before the ZEV mandate came into force, namely £86 per gram of CO2 per kilometre over their target per ICE vehicle they sell. That's the funny thing really. There have been fines on the cards for legislative non-compliance for years, but we don't really talk about that. If it's not the fault of EVs, people largely haven't cared. But here's the point. If they can do better than their CO2 target, if they can get their fleet average below their 2021 achievement, then they gain credits that they can use to offset the number of ZEV sales they have to make. And theoretically, they can earn quite a lot of credits this way. In 2024, up to 65% of their ZEV credits can be from this form of trading, or exchange if you will. That's a lot. That could help our example mythical manufacturer quite dramatically. 65% of their ZEV target is 14,300. So if they could achieve that, they would only need to sell something like 7,700 EVs this year. Less if they get any of those extra credits from car clubs, SPVs and WAVs. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think any manufacturer would manage to reduce their credits anything like that much. But I think they will use this mechanism, and that's because you get more benefit from doing so. This form of exchange is only allowed for the first 3 years of the scheme, but if you can get a credit this way, then you effectively earn that same credit for all 3 years, assuming that they remain under the exchange cap, which reduces across the 3 years, down to only 25% in 2026. However, that is 25% of a higher ZEV target percentage by that year, so it's still up to 8,250 fewer ZEV sales required by our mythical example manufacturer. That's a very handy bit of flexibility. What's more, there is a hint that they will be able to achieve this form of exchange, a little something in the data that suggests they are on target to make use of it. Remember those end-of-year peaks in BEV sales we saw earlier? What are they about? Well, this is where we switch from hard facts to opinion, but I do have an informed opinion about those peaks. The ZEV mandate came into force in 2024, but prior to that, manufacturers were required to achieve other targets, those CO2 emissions targets for their fleet as a whole that I mentioned a moment ago. And that's what I think those peaks are about. I think manufacturers have been pushing EV sales at the end of the year in order to ensure that their fleet CO2 emissions met their target. Before the ZEV mandate, each zero-emission vehicle lowered the total average fleet emissions. But as we saw, there's no significant peak in 2023, and that might mean they're in a good position. They are likely to have wanted to move EV sales into 2024 where possible, but I think it's more than that. By removing non-hybrid models from sale in the UK, they have been able to reduce their total fleet emissions, and that will pay dividends for the ZEV mandate. The way those peaks were achieved in all 4 of the last 5 years was probably through discounting and incentives. In other words, it cost the manufacturers money. The growth in market penetration of EVs means more sales of them, and more sales could mean more cost to those discounts and incentives if it applies to a lot of cars. After all, the discounts might get applied to a greater number of cars, resulting in greater total cost to providing those discounts, and that might be a problem for the manufacturers for sure. But this end-of-year boost in market penetration is not unprecedented, as we've seen. We have seen it in 4 of the last 5 years. Furthermore, the decline in battery manufacturing costs continues apace, so there should be a reduction in the cost of goods sold, the cost of building the car, for each BEV they make. Maybe the noise we're hearing from manufacturers, the complaints, protestations, and open letters we've seen aren't entirely an indication of a problem with the ZEV mandate. Is the ZEV mandate tough on manufacturers? It certainly is. They have been handed a bit of a political hot potato. Instead of the government having to tell you to buy an EV, the manufacturers instead have to encourage you to do so. That's a somewhat tougher proposition. This is a bit of a case of slopey shoulders, a transfer of responsibility away from the government to some extent. It's a fairly shrewd bit of politics to try to make the manufacturers the bad guys. Having said that, we needed the manufacturers to offer a compelling range of cars for us to buy. Something needs to encourage them to do the R&D and get the products launched, and then build at scale to bring costs down. We need for them to be taking risks they might otherwise not take so fast. In my opinion, the market probably did need a bit of a stir. More importantly, the dealers probably needed a shake-up. Sales is a cutthroat business, and salespeople earn much of their income from commission. Sales are swayed by manufacturer incentives for their sales teams. Therefore, getting manufacturers to fit their incentives around the societal benefit was necessary. Getting everyone involved in car sales singing from the same hymn sheet is important. The cost-benefit analysis of the ZEV mandate released by the government, link in the description, makes the position clear. Zero-emission vehicles benefit society, and that's why the ZEV mandate exists. I think the ZEV mandate has also played a small part in the story we'll see play out in 2025, a story of cheaper cars, bringing electrification within reach of more people. Mass market adoption relies on more affordable models being made available. And that's why I'm excited about the new level of affordability coming this year. If that's of interest to you, then it's covered in my last video, and there's a link to that from the end screen of this one, as well as the description. In summary, I'd say that the headline figure of 19.6% of the market being EVs is too simplistic. There is a lot of flexibility in the mandate, and that makes measurement of success by a single percentage figure too difficult. It's unlikely that any major manufacturer will pay fines under the ZEV mandate in 2024, and the sales data shows that growth in the BEV market share is back. The ZEV mandate is achieving what it intended to. The next few years are going to be tricky for sure, but the new level of affordability we see coming this year sure is going to help. And each time someone sees that their neighbour has bought an EV, or perhaps one of their friends, it will get them wondering if they should too. Thanks very much for joining me. Your questions and comments on this subject are most welcome. Do you see what I'm seeing in the data and the graphs that I've shown? If you've liked the video, then it's a help to me if you click the thumbs up button, and consider subscribing to the channel if you want to see more from me. Thanks.